Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. Hope everyone's doing good. It is Wednesday. It's hard to believe it's Wednesday already. These weeks just freaking fly right by. It's crazy. It is about 10:12. It's a Wednesday morning. The weather has been pretty awesome. It's finally feeling like spring 2023, so it's about it's about uh it's about damn time. It's about freaking time. So, yeah, I hope everyone's doing good. I did a show yesterday on a really awesome film called Homicidal by William Castle, who is I think one of the most important directors and one of the most creative forces and one of the most influential forces in the horror exploitation world. The show I did yesterday was focused on a movie uh, that came out in 1961 called Homicidal. This is definitely, I feel, it was even looked at the time when it came out, but I think even now it was looked at as a big time, kind of one of the first exploitation movies in the horror genre. I was looking up some reviews and what people were saying about the film, especially around the time when this film came out, and even some some things that people were saying about it now. But especially during that time, when you think when Homicidal came out in '61, it's pretty graphic. It's kind of sleazy. It's kind of a sleazy movie, but it was regarded as a pure knockoff film, basically a ripoff of Psycho. And with the world of exploitation, that is a big component of it. And again, it's one of those things I think a lot about, probably too much, but it's also something I think about a lot that probably most people don't don't really think of it in these terms. And I look at it as, okay, on one hand, or on one side of the discussion, or how I think about these movies, there you have movies that, especially in this day and age, movies that come out that are very similar to other films that also I feel like maybe to a degree are just totally ripping off another movie. And then you have, and that's more attributed to say bigger budget Hollywood films, or horror films that are like a major release, that by a major studio. So, like, one example, well, I think it's actually a pretty cool example of of how I'm thinking about it. One real big characteristic of an exploitation film, or a characteristic you see a lot in the exploitation world, is there are there's always a movie that comes out, say, like, for example, Steven Spielberg's Jaws, huge commercial hit. I think it's one of Steven Spielberg's best movies. Definitely a horror film. It was a phenomenon when that movie came out. It set box office records on fire, and it still remains to be, even to this day, a very very much a really well respected, and definitely iconic movie. But that movie was a major studio release. It had a massive budget. It had, top shelf actors. Steven Spielberg was kind of coming into his own in his career. A major Hollywood player, and he would eventually become even bigger after that film. Huge budget, like I said. major distribution, a huge budget behind it. It got it was it set the like I said, it set the box office on fire. And there was a bunch of movies that came out afterwards that were significantly low budget, didn't really have the cast of didn't have the high level character actors that Jaws had, and essentially there were a bunch of movies that ripped it off, that came out in the exploitation world. So like examples would be Bill Luswig's Maniac, also The Car with which came out shortly after that. Grizzly which was another film that came out around that time. A whole bunch of movies. In those movies, The Car, Maniac, Grizzly, those films were, when you compare the budgets to say a big movie like Jaws, were minuscule, and the actors, the quality of actors, like it wasn't like a top shelf billing. And but basically what they did was, these exploitation directors took that idea from what Jaws, took the storyline from Jaws and basically made a really low budget version of that film, like a guerrilla style version of that film. And for me, that's a big characteristic of the exploitation world, where you have these companies and these directors that were in the exploitation world that are trying to, like, they have a very very small piece of the pie, so they're trying to just manipulate that audience, but then also really dial in the sleazy factor, the violence, the gore, and it's just got this real, the films always end up having this real seedy quality to it. But that's definitely a characteristic of the exploitation world. But I think, when you take, for example, Maniac, which is my all-time favorite slasher film, I think, and I think those other movies I mentioned, which are definitely exploitation movies, but they're for me, they're some of my favorite movies in the genre. They rip Jaws off to such a degree, but it like crosses that line, or rides that fine line of where it's so bad it's good. And because of the nature of, because it's a guerrilla style, kind of a guerrilla style way of making a film, I think it works. And those films, even though, like, say, The Car, The Maniac, and Grizzly are really they're clearly ripoffs of, to a degree, of, say, a big budget movie like Jaws. It They're uniquely their own thing. They become, I feel like those films are inherently knockoffs, but in the process of that, they've become their own films, and that's due to the guerrilla style filmmaking that was used. They don't have the luxury of a huge budget. They don't have the luxury of getting massive actors of the time. They just go for it. They have an idea. They see an idea. They grab onto it. They latch onto it, and they just go for it. And they just try to deliver the goods. But I feel like those movies are ripoffs, but they're also at the same time very very different. And they're the writing isn't so great. The editing might not be on par, say, with a big budget film. The directors might not have the same, say, skill set that somebody like Spielberg has, but they have a lot of passion. And for me, those films, when I watch those films, they're like, I see Jaws on the screen, but yet it's, they, because because of the way they made the film, it feels like they're also highly original. And they're like and it also totes that line, but for me, with the idea of it's so bad it's good. And to me, that's like a real successful way of essentially ripping off a movie, if that makes sense. And an example of how I think it's not, at least in my taste, of where it doesn't work. And to me, it's so obvious, and it doesn't have its own personality at the end of the day. An example for that, as far as a big budget movie copying off another Hollywood blockbuster, or another movie that also had a very large budget. There was a movie that came out a few years ago. All these movies I'm talking about too now, I have done videos on them, and I think they're pretty good, worth checking out. Did a show on Grizzly. I've done a show on The Car, and of course Maniac, which is my all-time favorite slasher film. But there's a movie that came out, and I did a show on this also, called It Follows. It came out about, it came out about 7 or 8 years ago, I think now, and I did a show on It Follows, and I think when I was a little bit late to the game on seeing that movie. I saw that movie maybe a couple of years after it came out. And it's a newer horror film. It had a really large budget, big distribution, a big, pretty big budget Hollywood film, but definitely a horror film. But I really love that movie. I think it's one of the most original movies that's come out in the last few decades as far as in the horror genre. Highly inventive, really creepy, really suspenseful, a really original story. Really delivers the goods. But that film came out, and it was, for what it was and for what it was worth, was a huge hit. And it really, got a lot of acclaim, got a lot of attention. I own that on Blu-ray. Like I said, I did a show on it last year. I really love that movie. As far as newer, more contemporary horror films, I think it's definitely one of the best, and one of the most inventive, and one of the most original. And then last year, there was another movie that came out that was called Smile, which had a tremendous amount of acclaim. It was released in the theaters, but I think primarily it made its money online. But I think it did have a theatrical release. And that film, Smile, had tremendous acclaim. It had all kinds of great reviews. I saw that film maybe a year or so after it came out, and that was last year. Really, really acclaimed, really hyped film. It made a lot of money, grabbed a lot of attention. I saw it on numerous lists as far as people making their end of the year lists, as far as top, horror movies that had come out in 2022. And I finally got to see it, and I thought it was good. It was definitely creepy in a lot of ways. It had a high production value. It had some really great actors. Some of the direction in the film was really, really great. It was kind of I kind of consider it to be more of a highbrow horror film. Kind of what It Follows is. Even though that it is a raw movie, it still has this highbrow kind of way. It still has this highbrow essence, meaning that it does have a big budget behind it. But the thing that I did not really, the thing that took me out of watching Smile was that I felt like it was a complete and utter knockoff of It Follows. Like, literally, it was, I felt frame by frame, and even the way the narrative was for the story was that it was such a ripoff of It Follows that I just found myself, even though I liked it and I thought it was technically really well done, and there were some really good, there was some really great writing in that film, I still felt that at the core it was like a total ripoff of it follows. So it took me out of the movie, and I just felt like I didn't really enjoy that movie. It was totally trying to capitalize on something that a previous idea that was highly original, and it didn't. For me, it didn't work. And so, like, that's an example of where I feel, and again, these are just my opinions, but that's an example of where I feel like it doesn't work. And Smile didn't. I came away with it thinking, well, okay, when I'm discussing the idea of one of the big traits of exploitation, where a lot of these movies rip off big budget films or big budget ideas, and it most of the time uniquely becomes its own thing. Even with that being said, with this with Smile, I felt like it never really moved into that territory, and it never really had its own personality. It just was, to a degree, a carbon copy of a much more original idea. So I think for me, that's where I see a really big distinction between films that rip off other movies and movies that are modeled off of hits, per se, and where it kind of works in some situations really, really well, and in other situations it doesn't work at all. And so today today I'm going to be covering another William Castle movie. And when I was so I've been, I watched Homicidal the other night, and I just watched this other film of his, Mr. Sardonicus. I got this collection a couple of years ago on Blu-ray, and it's a really awesome collection. It has two movies. It's really the quality of the transfer on Blu-ray is really, really great. The only thing that is not great is there are zero special features on here. I got this few years back, couple of years. I think I've had this for at least 2 years. It was super cheap, and I really I had kept hearing about William Castle and knew who he was, but I wanted to dive into some more of his films, so I saw this, so I snagged it up. It was really cheap, and it's got two classic movies on here. But again, the only thing that really stinks is there's no special features. There's not even a commentary track, which is really too bad. But the thing that's really interesting, like I did the show yesterday on Homicidal, and I was looking up reviews and like what people thought of the film, especially when it came out. And this film, and I thought it too after watching it. It's definitely considered to be one of the earliest exploitation movies in the horror genre, and this movie was considered to be a total ripoff of Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock's Alfred Hitchcock's classic movie. Just pretty much overall, I'm a huge Hitchcock fan, and pretty much overall, I would have to say Psycho is probably my favorite movie of his amazing career. But Homicidal it came out a few years after Psycho, and it was considered to be a total knockoff, a total ripoff of Psycho, and and to a degree, it really is. It's so similar to the original story of Psycho, and the narrative of how what the core of the story is about, even to around who the psychopath is in the story. And there's actually an element of where there's the killer actually is dresses up in drag. But at the same time, like, this was considered, it was interesting because Homicidal was kind of considered one of the earliest kind of exploitation movies in the horror world, and it definitely is. But again, much more low budget than Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. It didn't have the clout. It didn't have the highest level of actors, well, in comparison to Psycho. But I have to say, even though it's a total knockoff of Psycho, it's uniquely its own thing. And again, it goes back to that discussion that I had in the top of the show of at least how I feel when a film rips off another film, and sometimes it works and sometimes it really doesn't. But I think that this is an example of how it really does work, because it is the film goes in much different, goes in lots of goes in much di- different directions than Psycho. It doesn't clearly rip off the entire film. The basic premise it does, but I feel like it's uniquely its own thing, and it's a kind of a complex storyline. But I thought it was interesting, a real interesting thing. And this came out in '61, and William Castle, like I said, I did the show on Homicidal yesterday, and I talked a lot about all of his films and how just incredibly prolific. I started reading off the list of films that he worked on, and not only was he, a director, predominantly known as a director, he was also a producer and also an actor himself. And I think, again, so it's been great. And I watched Mr. Sardonicus last night, and today's show is featured on that. And I thought it's super cool to like revisit him. His probably his two William Castle's two most well known films are the House on Haunted Hill, starring Vincent Price. That was probably his biggest film. That was also remade, I think, within the last 10 or 15 years. And also 13 Ghosts, which is another horror classic. That was also remade within the last 10 or 13 years. But William Castle, I think, definitely one of the most important figures in the world of horror exploitation. And Mr. Sardonicus is an awesome movie. I don't think I had ever seen it until I watched this. I watched it last night, and I believe it was the first time I'd ever seen it. And it's amazing. It's so incredibly cool, incredibly original. One of the things I thought about when I started watching it is the way the film starts off. It really reminded me of Bram Stoker's Dracula. It had this really interesting thing where you almost had this like Jonathan Harker character in the beginning of the film who is invited to this like castle by this really kind of strange and mysterious figure who you don't see for quite a while. And it has this whole journey that he goes on, which really reminded me of Bram Stoker's Dracula. But then it goes completely in a different direction. And William Castle was at his time during his time of being a director, he was so prolific. Like he put out sometimes 2 movies a year. Like it's just crazy. And Mr. Sardonicus also came out in 1961. And the story is like highly original. It's like a gothic horror tale. Sir Robert Cargrave, Ronald Lewis, a gifted London doctor researching experimental treatments for paralysis, receives a mysterious letter written in a familiar hand. Following its instructions, Cargrave travels to the foggy mountains of Gorslava, Transylvania, where he must treat the horribly disfigured Baron, Sardonicus. And again, this movie is such a gothic, has such a gothic aesthetic. Super creepy. There are definitely some scenes in the film that are kind of disturbing. It's and again, I had never seen this film before, and it's amazing how prolific William Castle was. It stars Guy Rolfe, Ronald Lewis, Audrey Dalton, Lorna Hanson, Oscar Homaka, Vladimir Sokov, Constance Cavendish, and it's a and it's so beautifully shot. The set the sets that were designed and used in this film are just incredible. It's again, it just has this like really sweeping gothic quality to it. Great, great in camera effects. When you think that this film, great use of practical effects. When you think that this film came out in '61, is wild. Like, it's just so ahead of its time. but it just has. I always talk about one of the things that I love. If I'm won over by, or if I find myself really digging a movie or falling in love with a movie, the pretty much the biggest factor for me that usually does it for me is the atmosphere. If a movie has a real rich atmosphere in the horror genre or what have you, and it has this atmosphere where it's really rich and it really adds to the escapist quality to the movie, then I'm usually a big fan. And Mr. Sardonicus really dials that in. It has such a great escapist quality. It's definitely much more of a like a gothic, like an old school gothic kind of story, and it definitely resembles Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's very very interesting. Great music, the cast is great, and like I said, the practical effects and the year that this film came out is pretty staggering. And I can't stress it enough that I think William Castle, so many movies that he directed. I mean, to think that he made, when I was going over his list of films that William Castle directed yesterday, and I was talking about them in the show yesterday, I realized, wow, I could spend a whole show just reading off the list of films that he directed, and I wasn't even touching on the movies that he acted in. He's actually in both of these movies for like he makes these little cameos, and it's very cool because he does this whole thing where he's like essentially like breaking that third wall, and he's like actually talking to the audience, and it's super cool. Like you don't that's the whole breaking that third wall kind of thing is such an interesting way of telling a story. You just don't see it that often, and I think it's something that's underutilized. It's really powerful, and it really grabs your attention as a viewer. The last film that I saw where that was used so highly effective, or was such a highly effective element, was actually Deadpool, the first Deadpool movie, and it really pulls you into the movie. But there's two scenes, or actually there's two scenes in Mr. Sardonicus where William Castle is actually in the movie, and it's super cool. And he's like literally talking to the audience, and it happens right in the beginning of the movie, and it happens right at the end, and it's great. It's super original, and again, it's one of those things where I felt like when that happened, I just enjoyed that experience even more. It felt like it was almost even more of a like a personable thing of being pulled in. But amazing movie, Mr. Sardonicus. And when you think too, like I said, reading this list of movies, how many movies he came out with. Like there was like two or three movies that came out that he had directed that came out in '61 alone. Crazy, just crazy. And that's also one of the characteristics of a lot of these great early exploitation directors, and also exploitation directors in general. They could do so much for so little. Like they'd have these minuscule budgets, but they would just like churn out movies left and right. And you think of films and directors now, sometimes there are years and years and years between when a film gets made. Case in point, Todd Field, a really talented director. But there's like 10 years in between each of his films. I mean, he's not an exploitation movie director, but it says something for this amazing genre. So this is Jason Dean. I highly recommend Mr. Sardonicus. Super cool movie, very very suspenseful, amazing atmosphere. Just a real classic kind of gothic story, and definitely influenced by Bram Stoker's Dracula, I would have to say. So this is Jason Dean. Thanks again for your support. And if you like this channel, please subscribe, and we will keep these videos coming. Thanks. Have a great day. Peace.